I got to say, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think, especially considering where we are at this point in history, globally, domestically, what I've been reflecting on a lot is just the importance of communities, whether it be across racial, ethnic, gender lines, coming together to fight for a common cause. So I think this documentary and what it focuses on with Black and Jewish alliances is so very important. I wanted to open this conversation up with just allowing you to speak to some of the origins of Jewish advocacy against racism in America, Black and Jewish alliances. What do we see as one of the earliest instances that in American history that we should all know about?
Well, I think the earliest instance is even before Jews encountered Black Americans in any significant way, and that's going back to 1852 and when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was translated into Hebrew and Yiddish. And there were Jews thousands of miles away on the other side of the Atlantic who read the book in Yiddish or in Hebrew. And one of them was this young Polish guy, teenager, named David Grin in Plonsk, Poland. And it really inspired him to fight against injustice, racial injustice, other kinds of injustice. And a few years later, he moved to Palestine. And he changed his name to David Ben-Gurion, and he wound up becoming the founding figure, the first prime minister of the state of Israel. And however controversial Israel might be today, it's important to understand that for him, that novel inspired him to engage in what he believed was the liberation of oppressed people. And he really believed, in his own way, he really believed that Jews and oppressed people throughout the world, including Black Americans, that they had common cause.
And that's profound to me because I spent a long time teaching about the causes of the Civil War and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I never knew that fact right there. And I knew the book was tremendously global at the time, and I recall Abraham Lincoln, of course, saying that this was the book that caused the Civil War, but I did not know that it spread and it was so ubiquitous like that. So how do we see that impact in America? Outside of what, of course, became the Civil War, what does that develop into after Harriet Beecher Stowe's book?
Well, what it turns into is like you said, is a global awareness of enslavement and of Jim Crow. This is something that people all over the world are reading about, including Jews, whether it be Jews in Eastern Europe or Jews who recently arrived as immigrants in the New World. So the Yiddish press covered, for example, the Springfield Race Riot in 1908 or the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. The Yiddish press covered these things extensively with a very sympathetic approach towards the Black victims, because for Jews, when they read about these events, it was basically, for them, a repetition of the kinds of pogroms, the violent attacks against Jews in Russia that they had been experiencing from the 1880s through the early 1900s. So there was a lot of awareness and sympathy throughout the Jewish world.
Another interesting fact that I'm learning, I feel like I'm in class right now. I love this as a history teacher. So let's go back in time, right? So we're talking the 1900s, 1908 race riots. We're talking the Tulsa Race Massacre, the early 1920s. That's a completely different world than the one we live in now. We were just talking about like the distraction that social media can be in the class and cell phones and things of that nature. So back then, though, news isn't spreading as fast, right? I recall throughout American history this effort to restrict Black Americans from learning certain stories because it could inspire them, right? So how are these stories reaching an international audience at this time? In particular, how are Jewish folks abroad learning about this? Are they doing it because they're curious, or is it being spread by somebody here in America?
Well, it's a little bit of both, but it just so happens that a particularly horrific pogrom that happened in the city of Kishinev, which is today in Moldova, 1903, and it killed 49 Jewish people. And it just so happened that there was a Jewish individual in Kishinev who was very much involved in a kind of a news agency that spread news regarding the Jewish world, and he made sure that the news got out over the telegraph lines very quickly. And so within just a few days, the whole world knew about the Kishinev pogrom. And then William Randolph Hearst from the Hearst newspapers, he picked up the story. And it became, in the words of our language today, it became viral. And there was a huge amount of anger in the United States against Russia for perpetrating this pogrom, and former President Grover Cleveland spoke out against it. And William Randolph Hearst said that the U.S. should go to war with Russia about it. So people knew about this pogrom, and of course the Black American press also followed it. And there's a African American newspaper in Cleveland right around a little later that writes about these horrible things happening to Jews and notes that, well, Black Americans have been dealing with this on a daily basis for many decades now. So there's sympathy, but there's also a plea for recognition that it's happening to us too.
That's powerful. That's powerful. So let's stay around that time period. We know in 1908, the NAACP is founded based on what happened with Springfield race riots. And what is particularly interesting and devastating about that is currently, we know Sonia Macy, who was killed by an officer in 2024, not too far from where I am in the Chicago area. As we are recording this, there was just a verdict in that case. And what is disturbing about the story, though, is the fact, considering how she was killed while asking for help, but also, too, the fact that she had an ancestor who was also lynched in the race riots, right? So there's this stark connection and dark connection over the course of time. What led Jewish folks in America at that time to look at that race riot and then want to join in to create the NAACP? Because again, we know these instances always existed throughout history, and this is why this documentary is so important to shed light. But also, too, you would think that a lot of folks during that time would want to stay behind the scenes, right? Because your life would be at risk, especially if you're Jewish. What led to the formation of the NAACP around that time in relation to the Springfield race riot?
Well, a lot of the early history of the NAACP, of course, is the product of Black Americans, W.B. Du Bois just one of them. And it's interesting that there was a kind of I'd say a comfortably well-off, upper-middle-class white population that felt genuine sympathy, humanitarian, really outrage about Springfield. And there were a couple of journalists on the scene. There was a guy named William Whalen, who was a Kentucky gentleman, very aristocratic, very well-off, but a true social reformer. And his wife, Anna Strunsky, was a Russian Jewish immigrant who had spent time in California, and then she married him. And they were journalists, and they covered this riot. And I think that for her in particular, it reminded her so much of what was happening to Jews in her own country, original country. And the two of them, I think, although he gets the credit as being one of the founders of the NAACP, it's really her as well. But it's not just them. There's also the Spingarn brothers, Joel and Arthur Spingarn, who are also involved in the founding of the NAACP. These are people who are, like Arthur, he's a lawyer dedicated to civil rights issues already in the early 1900s, and for almost a couple of decades, he was the president of the NAACP. So there's a whole world here of Jews who get involved right at the beginning.
Profound. So keeping it on that same topic, what do you think made W.E.B. Du Bois's alliance with Joel Spingarn so impactful during that time period?
Well, Jews and Jewish and Black Americans have common interests. They also have common enemies. And there's genuine humanitarian concern on the part of at least some American Jews for Black Americans. The question is what nature it takes. So I'll just give an example. There's a poet, a guy named Abel Maripol, who in 1937 writes a poem called Strange Fruit. And he performs it within the context of socialist activism, where Jews and Black Americans really can come together. And then Billie Holiday gets a hold of the song and she records it. And I think that humanitarian sympathy, largely but not solely through the Communist Party of America, is one place where Jewish and Black Americans could join up. But there is a power differential, and we have to never forget that. So another musical example is that of George Gershwin, who loved African American music. And in 1924, he writes Rhapsody in Blue, and there's a section about 6 minutes in where he's not stealing from, but he's paying homage to James Johnson's Charleston. And in Porgy and Bess, he really wanted to highlight the plight of Black Americans, but he's doing it as someone who was coded as white. He's doing it as someone who, although there's a hierarchy of white people in America at that time, and Jews are not at the top of the hierarchy in any way, but they're still white. And he is basically explaining the plight of Black Americans to a large audience. So that power differential is there, but there's also genuine humanitarianism.
Yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge too, because that led to some of the friction we even saw in the NAACP. What are some of the ways you think we could better acknowledge that, particularly as a device for more cohesive alliances today? Because like you said, the appearance of being racially white in this society leads to that imbalance.
Well, I think we have to be honest about it. And there are times where those frictions can become ugly. You know, like the 1968 teachers' strike in Brownsville, where you had a lot of longtime Jewish teachers who were getting laid off, and you've got a clash. You have an economic clash of interest there. But what we have to remember is that it's something in my own work I call the horizontal alliance. Jews need friends. They need allies. They can't make it alone. And what made American Jewish life so successful throughout so much of the 20th century was alliances. Alliances with the Democratic Party, with the labor movement, with Black Americans, with the civil rights movement. And through those alliances, Jewish Americans flourished. We're in an era now where those alliances are fraying. It's not good for Black Americans, it's not good for Jewish Americans. So we have to understand that, yes, there are going to be material disagreements, but in the end, I think Jewish and Black Americans historically, it's not just normatively, but historically, they have had a lot of common interests that they need to keep in mind and preserve.
Powerful. What do you think has led to this divide? If this is something that was known over 100 years ago, if this is something that was known and understood during the civil rights era, is it as simple as us not understanding our history, or do you think there's something deeper that has led to this friction?
Look, it's easier for people to sympathize with each other when both sides see each other as victims. So I'll give an example. In 1908, this northeastern Jewish guy named Leo Frank goes down to Atlanta to manage a pencil factory. He's accused of raping and murdering one of the young girls that works there. He's convicted. His sentence gets commuted because the evidence was really dodgy against him, but then a mob basically breaks into the prison and they murder him in 1915. So this is something where, again, Black Americans feel like, wow, we've seen this before. You know, this is basically a Jew getting lynched, that's really what happened. And again, the Black American press is commenting on this. And the Jewish Americans who are trying to defend Jews against anti-Semitism say, you know, we and Black Americans have common interests, especially because in 1915, the year that Frank got lynched, the Ku Klux Klan was revived. So it's all coming together. So when the Anti-Defamation League is founded, that's founded around 1913, there's an awareness of a common situation here. Again, common enemies, common problems. It gets a little more difficult when you get later in the 20th century over a couple of issues, mainly domestic. You know, are you going to give preference to admission to a university or a job to a Black American or a Jewish American or a white American who might be Jewish? Or then you get to the issue of Israel-Palestine. Well, back in the 1960s, most American Jews were very supportive of Israel. Many Black Americans were too, but there was also a Black American voice that was very sympathetic with the Palestinians. And that has continued and actually strengthened to our own day. So the fact is that there are going to be areas of profound disagreement, and we have to acknowledge those areas. I think the problem is that this is not a zero-sum game. In other words, I think it's going to be probably a little easier, frankly, for Black and Jewish Americans to talk about things that are happening 3,000 miles away. Let's talk about Israel-Palestine in a way that acknowledges, let's say that I have a connection with Israel, but you have this deep sympathy for the Palestinians. Let's say that's the case. Fine, let's talk about it. We can get past that. And I think we can also work on common interests, what the government is doing in terms of rounding up people and deporting them and so forth. This is not good for anybody, at least not good for, I think, either of these communities. So there's going to be these ongoing differences. But I think we have to acknowledge them to begin with, but then understand, most importantly, this is not a zero-sum game. Both sides can come out of this as victors if they work together.
Yeah, what I gather from that is just this, as a former classroom history teacher, I would always start in the 1600s, not just to talk about enslavement, but the formation of race in this country. And you learn early on that it was created to literally divide and conquer by creating these artificial social constructs. And within that, there are people, most of us, are not within that top 1% or whatever. So we began to fight amongst each other for what we perceive to be as the privileges of what the economic elite might have. And that's what I've seen. You talk about from that time of the 1600s through the 1900s, and here we are now. And I see a bigger issue with how a lot of us, we quite frankly live segregated.
I know that a general Jewish association with radicalism, with the left, with social reform, that's something that goes back to the late 19th century, and it actually starts in the Old World. It starts in Russia. and then some of the immigrants bring it over with them or they pick it up here. It's the notion that, again, Jews are one of those groups that are looked down upon, persecuted, marginalized. And you're right that whiteness in 20th century America was variable. You know, Italians in the early 20th century were not coded as fully white. Jews were not coded as fully white. To use our own language, they were white-ish. Yeah. So another thing to keep in mind is that, like if you look at socioeconomic profiles of Jews versus Black Americans, in the 20th century, many Jews were well off financially and a lot weren't. You know, there's rich and there's poor. And one thing that's worrisome about our recent political conversations is coding Jews as all uniformly white, powerful, privileged. That does not capture the complexity of anti-Semitism, which is growing all around us in our own era, about the socioeconomic diversity of the Jewish community, about Jews of color. The fact is that there are, I don't know if it's 10 to 15% of American Jews are in some way or another, they're not Ashkenazic. There's a lot of interesting interrelationships between Black and Jewish Americans, even within the realm of religious community. Black rabbis and so forth, and Jews who identify both as Black and as Jewish. So we have to get rid of these dichotomies and understand, again, that it's okay to acknowledge differences and acknowledge power differentials. That doesn't mean that we cannot work together.
I love that. I love that. And you had a classroom full of Jewish kids and Black kids who are Gen Z or whatever. What would you speak to them about?
Well, off the top of my head, I would probably think about the relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest theologians, rabbis, civil rights activists of the 20th century. And the relationship the two of them had, the fact that they were marching together in Selma, that Heschel, who was a proud, committed, deeply, deeply observant Jew, felt morally and ethically compelled to seek out an alliance with African Americans, in particular with Dr. King, that world of the 1960s, I know we can't just go back there. It was 60 years ago. We're in a different climate right now. But there are aspects of that world that we can learn from and appreciate. And the fact that, again, a figure as central as Heschel was so involved with someone as central in the civil rights movement as Dr. King, I think I would find that as inspiring.
Yeah, I think to your point, the more you study that era, the more you see the nuance of everyone, that was involved. I recall watching Selma and learning about James Reeb, for example, and not knowing about that until then. And you leave a lot of times, when I would share content or even speak to my students, there's this disgust that they weren't taught about this, because we're often taught that it's simply metaphorically just black and white in every aspect of society. So I think that is very important to understand and know. So also around this time, when we talk about the NAACP and the W.E.B. Du Bois, one of his chief political rivals, of course, was Booker T. Washington. And he formed a partnership with Julius Rosenwald, right? So can you speak to the impact of that partnership, but also, too, just the role philanthropy can play in forming these alliances and fighting for equity?
So it's a really great question that gets to the point of a power differential. Here we have a man who really has good intentions. Julius Rosenwald, founder of Sears Roebuck by the early 20th century, one of the wealthiest men in America. And what does he do with his money? He wants to give it away. And between 1912 and about, 1932, he helps found 5,000 elementary schools for Black children in the South using matching funds. Now, he worked with Booker T. Washington on this project, and in particular on the funding that Rosenwald provided for Morehouse, Spelman, Howard, and other historically Black colleges and universities. So that's also Julius Rosenwald, not doing by himself, because it's always partial funding and then others provide the rest. But he also provided money for the Tuskegee Institute. So yes, he and Booker T. Washington had a similar kind of gradualist, philanthropic approach. It's not radical. It's not overtly political, and there are people who in time get tired with that, right? They want something more immediate. They want something, again, more radical. But Rosenwald, I guess, embodies the strength and maybe the limitations of what a man like him can do. But he cares deeply about making the world a better place.
I love that. I love that. Where do we go from here? How do we strengthen these bonds, these relationships, and specifically as a tool for social justice today? Where do you see this going? I'm trying to think of a more direct way to say it. But I think you understand what I mean. Like, where do we go from here? How do we change the divide that we have now, in your opinion, in closing?
I taught a course last spring on Israel-Palestine. There were black students in the class. There were Jewish students in the class. There were Arab students in the class. Now, they were the ones who were willing to take the class. Mm-hmm. And we had great conversations, and nobody got angry at anybody else, and there was no tension, although there was disagreement. So they were willing to, as it were, sign that compact and say, okay, I'm going to accept difference. I'm going to accept that we're going to disagree, and that's okay. We're going to respect each other as human beings. Now, how do we scale that up from what happens in a single classroom at Harvard University to what happens in this messed up country of 330 million people? Yeah. That's hard for me. Okay, that's up to the politicians and not up to the college professors. But there are these examples, and I've been inspired by them. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.